Well, welcome to our fourth presentation in our Ulrich Salon Circle series entitled Art on the International Stage. To my mind, our first three talks have been enlightening and perhaps even somewhat entertaining preambles to this evening's special event. Our first two speakers provided their rich historical perspective on the increasing globalization of the art world over the past several decades. Gillian Poole's Russian and Eastern European exploits with her Fund for Arts and Culture, and Virginia Shore's update on the important activities of United States Arts and Embassies program, launched by President Kennedy in 1963. And of course, last month, Laura Graziano gave us all important tips if we're ever required to take Fabergé eggs through LAX or Heathrow, and if memory serves, a Prado shopping bag is essential. This evening, our very special guest is Mr. Dan Byers. Dan is the Richard Armstrong Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at Carnegie Museum of Art. And he's also a co-curator with Daniel Bauman and Tina Kukilski of the 2013 Carnegie International. In addition to his work on the International, recent projects at the museum include solo exhibitions of Kathy Wilkes and James Lee Byers, as well as the group exhibition Reanimation. In conjunction with Carnegie International, there has been an ambitious reinstallation of the Carnegie Museum of Art's Modern and Contemporary collection, of which Dan is also responsible, emphasizing the role of the International in past acquisitions, as well as the museum's core strengths. Dan is a graduate of Skidmore College and obtained his master's degree in curatorial studies from Bard College. Before joining the staff at the Carnegie in 2009, Dan was curatorial fellow at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis and assistant to the directors at Fabric Workshop and Museum in Philadelphia. On October 10, 2013, Roberta Smith wrote in her New York Times Review, quote, the 2013 Carnegie International is a welcome shock to the system of one of the art world's most entrenched rituals. This lean, seemingly modest, thought-out exhibition takes the big global survey of contemporary art off steroids. With only 35 artists and collectives from 19 countries, the latest Carnegie says no to the visual overload and indigestible sprawl frequent to these exhibitions. It also avoids the looming, big-budget showstoppers for which they are known. But did I mention that half of the artists are women? End quote. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we have the very good fortune to have as our guest one of America's brightest curatorial talents. Please join me in welcoming to Wichita, Mr. Dan Byers.
Well, I've seen about 15 minutes of Wichita, but so far, so good. And a lot of the Dallas airport, which treated me very well. But thank you to Bob for the invitation, and to Jody for picking me up at the airport, and to Carolyn for the last-minute booking, and everyone at the Ulrich for this invitation. I've never been to Wichita before. I've been to many places in researching this exhibition, and I'm really happy to add Wichita to the portfolio. This is a talk that I've given a lot before the show opened, and I think this is the first time I've given the talk kind of after the show is open, which is a really great opportunity because over the past 5 months, I've learned a lot about what we actually did. We spent 3 years putting the show together. It was entirely hypothetical for 3 years. It was a very expensive hypothetical idea. And seeing it installed and hearing people's reactions and giving tours has been a really rewarding experience. I put together about 6 different presentations last night, and I'm going to see where we go with this one. That's right, so we'll start with some basics. We like to think of it as the most important exhibition of new international art in the United States. There are 450 biennial-type exhibitions in the world, but in this country, there's really only a few that look at international art. Of course, the Whitney Biennial is only American art. You have Site Santa Fe, there's now Prospect in New Orleans, but the Carnegie International began in 1896, so it was started the year after Andrew Carnegie founded the institution, and Carnegie was not a collector like Frick and his other friends, Mellon. Instead, he charged the museum to look after the old masters of tomorrow, which is probably something he never said, but it's something that we say and has guided us very well. So normally this is a big exhibition of kind of a sort of speculative look at who's going to be important from around the world. We decided to sort of break that up into a number of components that could speak to each other from different perspectives. So we came up with this tagline: a major exhibition of new international art, a playground, the museum's collection, and an engagement with the city of Pittsburgh. Normally, it's just a major exhibition of new international art, but we added these somewhat unexpected elements to this edition. Partially, this is because the exhibition was organized by three of us, and it was really a conversation amongst us. This is the list of artists, which isn't entirely helpful just as a list, but there you go. There are 35 artists from 19 countries, and this is a much more diverse, globally, exhibition than the International has been in the past. About half the artists are from outside of Europe and the US, which is a much larger number than in years past. And in some way, this was because Daniel and Tina and I could sort of split up the globe and travel independently to do research. Here we are at our first meeting at the Frieze Art Fair in London. You can't really see that neon says taxpayers' money, which we thought was a good, auspicious way for us to begin our research together. If only more taxpayers' money funded contemporary art, but instead we thought we would begin there. So we started working in London on about October 10th, 2010. We actually had never worked together before. I'd never met Daniel. I'd met Tina once. Our director sort of curated us together into a team, and luckily we got along extremely well, and I think taught each other a lot about art in the process. Daniel is from Basel, Switzerland, and has just moved back there. Tina had come from the Whitney in New York. I had been at the Carnegie for a few years, and we began there in London. I'm just going to go through some quick pictures of us traveling, just to sort of set the background. We spent 2 years really going everywhere, and we had special concentrations in the Middle East. So these are some pictures I took going to Ramallah in Palestine from Jerusalem. My colleague Tina went to the Sharjah Biennial. This is a really bad traffic jam in Beirut, which was actually a protest. She was there during the Arab Spring, which was a really interesting time to be in Beirut and meet artists. Daniel went to South Africa to meet with Zanele Muholi, who's the artist you see there with her portraits in the background, which form a really important part of our exhibition. This is a Warhol taken at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. We sent our Swiss curator to Iran. We thought that was probably the best way to do it. They have a really incredible collection of contemporary art, actually, that the Shah had put together. Here I am in Hong Kong. I found a Carnegie cafe there and felt very at home. But we started the process early. We had 3 full years to do the exhibition, which is actually a lot of time to work on a show. It's really a luxury, and in some cases it felt like it was almost too long. One of the first things we had to do was put together a graphic design and identity for the exhibition, and we worked with a really interesting design team to do that, emphasizing kind of different components put together to form a conversation. And our first real initiative was a blog. And blogs are now not the most revolutionary thing. You want Twitter and Instagram, and we did all that. But we wanted to start sharing with people information about where we were going, but also to broadcast out to the world things about Pittsburgh. So this blog became a place that me and my colleagues shared a lot about where we were going, but also the kind of specificities of Pittsburgh, because we really wanted the exhibition to be an exchange between Pittsburgh and the world. I think this is from Tumblr, where we scanned thousands of past installation shots from Carnegie Internationals going back to 1896. So there's an incredible archive which really sets the exhibition in its history and in the context of the museum. And I'm going to talk more about that because that relationship to the institution, to the museum, to its history, its sense of publics was a really crucial thing for us in organizing the exhibition. More installation shots. So these began to circulate online, and we could really begin to create a foundation for our viewers both in Pittsburgh and the world to sort of understand where we were coming from. We also shared and scanned a number of articles from the archive. David Smith famously refused the third place prize, causing a major ruckus at the museum. We have a lot of great works by him, and I always love this kind of political statement where basically he was like, well, first of all, if you're not going to give me first prize, forget third prize, and the money should be used to buy artwork anyhow. And I agree. So we also used the blog, this is another screenshot, to capture events that we put on at an apartment that we rented in a neighborhood called Lawrenceville, which is where a lot of artists are living. And we basically made our own kind of alternative space, a DIY art space for 2.5 years leading up to the exhibition. We programmed about 70 events there, inviting local artists and filmmakers and writers to do talks, performances, screenings. It's also where we had artists who were coming to Pittsburgh to do site visits stay, sort of embedded in a neighborhood rather than in the wonderful Wyndham Hotel that is across the street from the museum. It kind of shuts down around 9 o'clock. So this apartment became a place for us to share what we were doing with people in Pittsburgh, because normally the International sort of touches down or rises up like some Frankenstein every 3 or 4 years and then is silent. And we wanted a place where we could share our travels, share ideas about art with artists, get their feedback, and actually sort of build our ideal place to both hang out, but also to build an ideal viewing audience before the show actually opened. So these are just some shots of the space. The other thing that opened before the show was something called the Playground Project. And my colleague Daniel had very fond memories of growing up with the Losiwurm in Switzerland, which is this playground you see here. And his wife, Gabriela Burkhalter, is an urban planner and librarian and art historian, and she'd been doing research into the history of post-war kind of avant-garde playground design. And as we talked to her and Daniel more about these, it seemed like the playground was the perfect metaphor for the museum, or an imperfect metaphor, a metaphor we wanted to be more perfect for thinking about the museum. Because playgrounds are really a kind of vector where ideas about public space, education, risk, design, modernism, all of these things in history kind of come into contact with each other. And we thought a museum should really be a place where you risk in public with strangers, where you test out physically your space, you test out ideas. And so we thought a good gesture towards this would be to just plop this Losiwurm right down in front of the museum, which is what you see here. And you can see behind it a looming Richard Serra sculpture that was placed there in 1985, very discreetly right in front of the museum's main entrance, blocking the doors to all who might want to come into the museum, which is, of course, very Richard Serra, very interesting use of public space, not so welcoming. It's an enormous 3-story structure that encourages many people to use it as a sort of glorified urinal often. So we thought we would soften things up, make it more playful. And then in addition to the Losiwurm, we installed a whole exhibition about the history of playgrounds in the Hynes Architectural Center, which is a set of architecture galleries in the museum. So this is a sort of exhibition within the exhibition. And it's a really important kind of heart of the show. And there were a number of documents and documentation of playgrounds and play structures from Europe, from Japan, and from the United States. The history of playgrounds is really interesting. I learned a lot. You think about the fact that children used to play in the street before cars came on the scene, and so all of a sudden you needed a place for children to go that was safe. Many of the playgrounds in Europe and Japan are the result of massive destruction in cities after World War II, so you had a lot of empty space to use. And so there's this sort of traumatic history actually underneath a lot of playgrounds. And then it was an opportunity for a lot of architects and artists to experiment with form. So there's a whole exhibition installed which looks at this history. The show opened early because we wanted the playground to open in the warm months, not October, so people could actually use it. It got a lot of really great press. Here's an article from the Times that we were really happy with, and sort of set the scene in Pittsburgh for people to expect something a little bit different from the exhibition. Here's an installation shot of the playground project in the Hynes Architectural Center. So it was a really kind of free-form, almost DIY exhibition where we just, there is some order, but we wanted to have some energy to it as well. The other major exhibition within the exhibition is this installation from our permanent collection. So this is what you're looking at now. And as I mentioned earlier, there are 450 biennials in the world. When we started, there were 2. Venice started about a year before the Carnegie, and then there was nothing until the 50s when you had Documenta in Sao Paulo, and then by the 80s you have maybe 50, and then the 90s 100, and now there's 450, and I'm sure in 2 years there'll be 500. So we wanted to think about what made us unique in this mix, and really the most unique thing is that we buy a lot of art out of each international, and this temporary exhibition that happens every 4 years has really built the collection of the Carnegie Museum of Art. And it means that our collection has some incredible strengths, some glaring weaknesses, like all collections do, but ours are really tied to the tastes of curators, to the specificities of making an exhibition, and there's this almost geological layering of different Carnegie Internationals that you find in the collection. And we were fascinated by this because you have these beautiful kind of institutional stories and institutional memory embedded in each artwork that had a kind of story at the museum. And many of our board members who've been involved for 40 or 50 years have these incredible stories of artists coming in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and these objects still reside within the museum. And there aren't really any other biennials that collect out of them. Many are just organizations set up for the biennial. There's only a few that are actually hosted at museums. And we very much see this as a museum show, meaning that it has the responsibility to the city, to its visitors that a lot of biennials may not. So we got fascinated by this history and installed really its own kind of exhibition within this exhibition, tracing the history of artworks that were acquired out of internationals and also choosing works that could kind of thematically resonate with artists who were in this edition of the International. We also asked some artists to install works in the collection. So here's our Impressionism Gallery with a work by Laura Favoretto in the foreground, which involves thousands of pounds of steel plates, which you're probably familiar driving over in construction sites. This was a bit of a negotiation with our Impressionism curator, but I think she liked it eventually. So in addition to that really extensive showing, we also created an archive room that would show people past shots, concentrating on visitors actually interacting with art, because so often in these installation shots, there are no people, and it ignores the fact that museums are populated. There are places for people to be in and amongst artworks, and that vision of people in museums was something that really was important to us. Well, now here's some pictures that are empty. It's really funny, yeah, the pictures from we've got all these great people, and then you get to the 80s and 90s, and the people disappear. Interesting, I never noticed that. Oh, there's some in there. But, so this was a way for people to really see the history of the International. So we did all of this, and we spent years and thousands of dollars and many, many, many hours doing it. And then we had to actually organize the International, which 35 artists, 19 countries. There was a lot of buzz in Pittsburgh of people not really knowing what we were doing. And there's no theme to the show, but it is a collection of different themes. It's a collection of really unique voices. And here's some ways that we thought about it. We thought about it as a hymn to diversity. We wanted it to be challenging and funny and passionate, rooted in history. We wanted it to stay in touch with questions and experiences of the everyday. We also wanted to celebrate the museum as a place that you would sort of see the world anew. And this is left over from my fundraising days, that it's worth the ticket. I'm not going to ask you for any money, but It was a way for us to bring together, to really look at difference and diversity beyond questions of sort of political correctness or multiculturalism, but really to look at what happens when you bring different voices from around the world together, and what happens when these things are in space together. And there were a number of themes that kind of came out of this collection of artists, and these are things like history. The body and the figure emerge as a really important kind of political theme in the show. Abstraction, really a sense of place, ideas of social change, the role of the artist, and also the role of the museum. So if you think about those sort of broad themes as I go through the artists, that will be helpful. So starting with a sense of place, we invited a photographer from Philadelphia named Zoe Strauss to come to Pittsburgh to do a project. And Zoe got a lot of renown for putting on a project every year for 10 years under a highway overpass in South Philly, completely illegally, and just putting up her photographs and selling them for a few dollars to anyone who would come. She would spend months cleaning and sweeping under the overpass. And we were really interested to see what this photographer could do in Pittsburgh. She immediately gravitated to Homestead, which is right outside Pittsburgh. It was the home to Andrew Carnegie's biggest steelworks, miles and miles of steel production, and also the place where the Homestead riots happened, where there was sort of a major point in labor history in this country. And Zoe was fascinated by this labor history and also the fact that the steel mill is gone and it's been replaced by a huge sort of big box store, mall development that takes like 2 miles, and it's completely obliterated the downtown and moved all the jobs from industry to retail. And she was really interested to see what that did to the people there. So she set up a photo studio, a portrait studio, where anyone could come have their picture taken. Here are some shots of the studio itself. So this is a big commission. We commissioned about half the artworks in this show, meaning that we gave her the money and the wherewithal to do this. Here's another shot of the studio. And so Zoe moved to Homestead for about 2.5 months. She has kind of charisma that I would call her strongest artistic trait, and she basically went out into this community that's seen pretty hard times and persuaded hundreds of people to come in and have their picture taken. Here are some examples of the results, and as you can see, it ran a wide range of different kinds of people, and she became this really important part of the community. And so immediately we'd sort of begun to ground the exhibition in Pittsburgh in a way. Then all the portraits were hung in this hallway in the museum, and so a lot of people from Homestead could sort of come see their picture in the museum. She gave everyone a copy of the picture. A copy will come into our collection. And then she valued each photograph at $1,000, thinking that each person then was sort of given this thing that had this inherent value. Another project that was really cited in Pittsburgh happened at the Braddock Carnegie Library. So Andrew Carnegie's first and probably most important philanthropic contribution was founding thousands of libraries all around the English-speaking world. They're all over this country, all over the UK. And this image is of the first Carnegie Library, which was across the street, basically, from one of his steel mills in Braddock, which is also sort of on the outskirts of Pittsburgh and has the last functioning steel mill in the area. And there's a really interesting group of artists that call themselves Transformasium. It's 3 artists who moved from Brooklyn to Pittsburgh about 6 years ago. And they really wanted to, so the mayor of Braddock was offering free houses to artists who would come and transform the neighborhood. This idea that art can be this sort of force for urban change, which is itself a very complicated and fraught idea. So they came with that notion, they looked around and they said, well, there's actually already a lot going on here. And they identified the library as this place that was a vital community resource. And they sort of set up shop there. So one of them is the circulation manager, one runs the arts programs, another one runs a ceramics studio, and they opened up all these arts initiatives to actually make the library a place that could be a vital art center. And so their proposal to us was to create an art lending collection in the library. So anyone with a library card from Allegheny County, which is the whole sort of Pittsburgh area, can come here and take out an original artwork from the collection, take it home with them for 3 weeks, renew it up to 9 weeks, and there's these wonderful padded bags that the artworks come in, and it's an opportunity for people to live with artwork who would not probably have the opportunity to do so. The best part about this, I think, is that they asked every artist in the International to donate a work. So every single artist who's in the show donated an original artwork to the collection. So now there's this incredible collection of contemporary art in Braddock, which is a complete anomaly. And there's the hope that this will actually continue with each additional international. So you can take home a piece of art that would cost $25,000 if you bought it in New York, and you can take it out, bring it home, and set it up for your dinner party. And they employed 3 people to facilitate this, this collection, and they also sort of went through an art history program to do so. So here's, so this is what it looks like at the library. Those racks in the back have the artwork. And then at the museum, this is our lobby. Every 2 weeks, residents of Braddock curate an exhibition from this collection that goes on the walls of the museum. And this is the first iteration of that collection. So it runs from all the international artists to local artists in Pittsburgh to artists from around the country, as well as some poster reproductions, and it's this really great mix of artwork. So we were really interested in thinking about the museum itself as this place with a sense of place. And so about half of the artists in the exhibition made works for public spaces of the museum. This was partially logistical because we used all of our collection galleries for the collection show, and normally that comes down to accommodate works from international artists. But it was also purposeful in that we wanted to think about the museum as a kind of main street and think about those spaces as public spaces. So we invited Phillida Barlow, who is an English artist, to create a sculpture for our plaza. You can see the Richard Serra peeking out from behind her sculpture. Peter Sheldall, writing in The New Yorker, called this comparison like dragging a samurai into a pillow fight, which I thought was a really incredible way to talk about the relationship between Phillida's kind of beautiful but punk intervention into this space with Richard Serra's very authoritative sculpture. So this is a piece that includes thousands of these wood poles, each draped in concrete and mesh and fabric banners that were constructed in her studio in London and then shipped in 2 shipping containers to Pittsburgh. And then she and a crew built it for about 2.5 weeks before the show opened, which actually functioned as this great kind of open-air art lesson because there's the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University that sandwiched the museum, and you had thousands of students walking by every day who never come into the museum. And finally, they're asking what's going on here, and there's this great British lady telling them about what sculpture is. And she was our perfect kind of on-the-ground marketer as the show opened. And now this piece has a ton of snow on it. There were birds that were nesting in it. There's leaves in it, and that is exactly how she wanted it. If it were up to her, it would stay there forever and just deteriorate as the years go by. Although I think someone in Chicago is going to install it somewhere in downtown Chicago, which I think should be interesting. We also decided to use our cafe as a place for art. So this is a project by a Polish artist named Paulina Alauska. And Paulina became really interested in the history of puppeteering in Pittsburgh. There was a really important puppeteer named Margot Lovelace who worked out of Pittsburgh. And Paulina had investigated the history of Polish puppeteering in some of her earlier works. And so she turned our cafe into a puppet cabaret. And did this whole project based around the figure of the puppeteer, who is normally, of course, hidden, but in her work became the kind of star of the show. After the show, it becomes this sort of installation of props. You can't really see it, but this sign that she created says, "Puppeteering in America is truly a lonely craft." This sort of melancholic evocation, and then these big collages that went on the walls of the cafe. This used to be our coat room, and the artist Wade Guyton, who lives in New York, decided to use it as a painting gallery. So where you see those sort of marks on the floor, that's where lockers used to be. There used to be a carpet, and we ripped everything out and left it completely raw, and then replaced it with these very minimal paintings that he makes, as well as furniture from his studio. And he makes these paintings by taking canvas, huge canvases, folding them, and then putting them through enormous Epson printers and tugging them as they come out to sort of disrupt that process to create these paintings, which aren't really paintings. They're printed works, but they're treated as paintings. we were really interested in the relationship between the space created in the paintings and the space created in the coat room. And strangely enough, he's made a replica of the bar that you see on the side there for his latest gallery show in New York, which was bought by the Art Institute of Chicago. And I love the idea that the Art Institute now has a replica of the Carnegie's coat room bar by the artist Wade Guyton. And they talk about how painting is really sort of part of a network, and this could not underscore that idea more. We also asked him to do a project in our founder's room, which is a very different kind of room, where Andrew Carnegie used to sort of have his ring kissed when he would return to Pittsburgh. This is a very exclusive room, mostly used for board meetings and weddings and things like that. And Wade created these wonderful flame paintings for that room. It's only open from 4 to 5 every day, so there's this sort of exclusive aspect to it, where the coat room is for all comers and the founder's room is if you happen to be there and see it. This is our Hall of Architecture, where we asked a Colombian artist named Gabriel Sierra to do a project. These are all plaster casts of famous fragments of architecture. In the 19th century, this was how architecture was shown in museums, and you could have chosen out of a catalog what column you wanted, what church facade. This room was purpose-built for these plaster casts. So what Gabriel did was he painted all of the walls purple. They used to be this very kind of mute sage green, and he came in and said, no, they should be purple. This very simple gesture ended up taking a very long time and costing a lot of money. And he admitted to us that, normally curators never accept his first proposal. But we were game, and we loved the idea, and I think he thought to himself, okay. So he went ahead, and he was really interested in the way that in this space, it's a crazy space because there's actual architecture, which you see those sort of bigger columns on the side, and then there's the casts of similar columns, and of course the actual structural columns are replicas of ancient Greek columns, and then there's the casts of the Greek columns, and then there's pedestals for the architecture. So there's all these layers of architecture and display, and so Gabriel thought that the purple would sort of bring out these inherent contradictions. He was interested in the sort of royal, imperial connotations of purple. And then he inserted these kind of geometric sculptures within different parts. So you see this box that's kind of between two columns to kind of subtly bring to attention the different shifts that happen in there. Then we did a retrospective of an Iranian filmmaker named Kamran Sherdel in our cinema. So all day, about 6 films by Sherdel play, which are incredible documentaries, sort of experimental documentaries made in Iran in the 70s and 80s. He's never really shown his work in this country before. And then we did this great installation by a Chinese artist named Huo An in our lobby. And this is the view at night, which is really quite striking. These are all neon characters that he stole from around the city of Wuhan. And so they're damaged and kind of blinking. And it was a way to sort of engage these cities in China, which are accelerating and urbanizing at a rate that would be completely unfamiliar to all of us. Cities that have a population of 2 million people after 2 years, where everything changes and where, as an artist living there, he just felt like he had no ownership of the city. And these characters actually spell out, so he took different parts to combine them to spell out the name of his father who had just died and then the name of his favorite Japanese porn actress. So here you see a view of that with Transformasium's lending collection there. So all different things really come together in this show. This is our grand staircase balcony. You see in the background murals called The Crowning of Labor by John White Alexander. And then in the foreground are videos and sculpture by a Swiss artist named Tobias Madison, where he invited a local after-school group to make an abstract film, asking different children to play light, someone else to play sound, and basically giving them chaotic free reign of the entire museum. And he created this video where there's speakers that hang in these lanterns in this very kind of austere and august space. Here you see the lanterns which house all this kind of chaotic speakers. There are vitrines with drawings and paintings by an Iranian artist named Rakni Herazadeh, which take things like the British royal wedding, which you see here, and make them a little bit stranger. He is interested in spectacle, things like the royal wedding, as well as the Arab Spring and the kind of uprisings in Tehran, and they all get mixed into animations, which you see here installed against this kind of scene of Pittsburgh industry. This is the Hall of Sculpture, where the sculptures have gotten off the pedestals, had too much to drink, and are taking a nap. So these are images of works by Nicole Eisenman, who's an artist who lives in New York. You see her paintings in the background. We did sort of a survey of her figurative work in the balcony there, and then she started making these incredible plaster sculptures, which were made site-specifically to kind of dialogue with these various neoclassical plaster casts that we have there. Here you see her paintings. You see a guy on his iPhone, which is this wonderful kind of antisocial act, which I think 10 years ago we would have no idea what he's doing, but now it's this kind of iconic gesture of withdrawal next to this very classical pose, and then you see her paintings in the background. Here's a view from the balcony of two other projects there. In the foreground, you have a work by Pedro Reyes, where he turned guns that were donated to him by the Mexican army from Juarez in Mexico into musical instruments that play themselves. It's an incredible project that brought together definitely more guns than I've ever been in the presence of, and they sort of play in dialogue. So he made everything from a kind of slide guitar to an upright bass, all kind of these Mad Max contraptions, and then every 25 minutes they play together in this really beautiful, haunting composition. And it's definitely the first time I've ever seen people clap for a work of art, which was really kind of powerful. In the background, you have this great library called the Badoon Library, which is put together by a group of artists who publish a magazine called Badoon about culture and art in the Middle East. They're from Iran, but grew up in America, and it's this collection of books about the Middle East by people outside of the Middle East. So you have a whole section of romance novels with the word sheikh in them. Sex with the Sheikh, The Sexy Sheikh. It's this incredible quantity of pulp fiction. There's a whole column of books with the word veil in it. There's a board game called The Oil Crisis, which I can imagine would have been fun for the whole family. A laser disc of Not Without My Children. It's this incredible kind of projection of a region which is only really defined by people outside of it. The Middle East doesn't exist as an actual place, only through the kind of interactions by other places. And people can take these books off these walls that they design and read them. So we really wanted this place to bring together a lot of things. These are photographs by Joel Sternfeld, a New York artist, looking at different utopias in the U.S., where he traveled all over the country looking at back to the land groups, religious groups, kind of ecological groups, looking at this kind of American impulse to create a society outside of society. So now we finally get to the galleries, after everyone has been putting things around the museum. I'm going to go pretty quickly through these because there's a lot to see, but here are 2 out of 4 cubes by Italian artist Laura Favoretto that are about 500 pounds of confetti compressed into these cubes. There's no internal structure, there's no glue. You basically build a big plywood box, put in 10 pounds of confetti, put a tamper on it, get someone to jump up and down on it, take it off, 10 more pounds, continue, take off the sides, hold your breath, and these things stay. And then over the course of the exhibition, they kind of disintegrate into a pile of confetti. So we really wanted to begin the show with this, the cube, which is the sort of ultimate form of logic and authority, but that would become more provisional, that would disintegrate and kind of change as the exhibition went on. So you see that with works by Zanelli Muholi, which are photographs of the lesbian and transgendered community in South Africa who are the victims of really horrific violence, not just discrimination, but a lot of violence there. And her photographs are incredibly striking, beautiful, coming out of a tradition of portrait photography, but absolutely an activist project as well. And we wanted to sort of begin the exhibition in the galleries with a work that was engaged with the world like this. Here you see sculptures in the foreground by Vincent Fecteau, who's an artist who lives in San Francisco. These are all papier-mâché. They take him about 6 months to make. They're incredibly built up and then carved and then painted. And to us, they really reminded us of these landscapes that you see which you probably can't see that well. But these are by a really fascinating artist named Joseph Joachim, who was born in the 1890s, died in the 70s, was completely self-taught. He traveled all over this country with the circus. He was an advanced man who would put up all the signs in small towns. And then in the 60s, he settled in Chicago and started making these drawings of all the places that he'd supposedly gone to. They were incredibly influential to artists in Chicago at the time, people like Jim Nutt and the Chicago Imagists. And he's really an artist, and we wanted to show his work in this show. We wanted to show American artists that would make this country as strange and as beautiful and as foreign as any art from anywhere else that we would expect to tell us something about those countries. Here's an installation shot of that gallery. In the background are paintings by Paulina Olauska, the artist who did the Puppet Cabaret, looking at images from clothing catalogs in the 70s in Poland, these sort of Western fashions that you could make from the scraps of things you had around the house. Here's Joachim with an installation by a French artist named Pierre Leguion, looking at the potter George Orr, who was the mad potter of Biloxi, as you see here in this image. These are images that are pictures that he took of himself to promote his pottery in around 1910 in Biloxi. You can imagine his work may not have been entirely well received at the time there. No one bought anything. He has since gone on to be considered really the most important sort of forefather of American art pottery. It wasn't until the 60s when an antique dealer went down south from New Jersey to sort of scout out some folk art and happened upon this work, and then people like Jasper Johns started integrating it into his paintings. Andy Warhol was a huge collector. And Pierre, the artist who made this work, was really interested in, he's always interested in the way that artists' self-presentation relate to the works that they make. So he created this kind of terrarium for George Orr in reference to the Natural History Museum that is actually connected to our art museum. The next gallery features paintings by Henry Taylor, an artist who lives in Los Angeles, and sculpture by Sarah Lucas from London. And this was a kind of duet of figurative work. And these are artists who are not really shown together ever. Henry's work concentrates on figures from African American history and his friends and his family. It's incredibly loose and expressive and really powerful. And Sarah Lucas sort of came up with the YBAs in the 90s, this kind of in-your-face punk aesthetic, and in a sense really turned into a pretty sophisticated sculptor. And we just love the back and forth of using the body as this kind of place of not just expression, but kind of political commentary as well. From that gallery, you go to a very different kind of installation and a very different engagement with the human body. So these are 190 photographs by the artist Tehran Simon. Here's an example of a few of them. And these 190 photographs capture every woman, every vehicle, and every weapon in every James Bond film. So she spent 3 years tracking down every actress, every Bond girl, convincing them somehow, there's Grace Jones in there, to pose as they are now, probably not in the same pristine shape as they were when they were 21 or whatever in whatever Bond film. And then she found all the cars and all the vehicles in private collections, and she photographed them to put together this portrait of kind of the perfect accessories of the powerful Western man. And then to look at the way that, of course, people age and objects don't, and this kind of incredible collection. And when you're in this space, it's just this litany of bodies and objects that really give a portrait both of the Bond films, but also of, our culture in the last 50 years. This has been a popular piece. It's usually where some of the men on my tours start paying attention again. As you can see, you sort of go from a lot of different things here, and this run of galleries ends with a collection of scroll paintings by a Chinese artist named Guo Fengyi, who died a few years ago and was another self-taught artist. She was a factory worker who had to quit her job because she was experiencing pain and health problems, and started making these works as healing drawings, as ways to kind of deal with her pain, channel energy, and made these incredible kind of amalgams of bodies and landscapes and abstraction, and then people around the town started asking her to make them for them as well, or people who were sick. And she became this sort of town healer and artist. And so we were really interested in the way that artwork can have a kind of double or triple function. You can hang it in a gallery and see it, but this is work that actually, had a function that was medicine in some way, and to really think about how art can change people's lives. In that vein of sort of double functions, this is a work by Dinh Q. Lê, who's a Vietnamese artist, which collects about 100 drawings done by Viet Cong fighters during the Vietnam War. So there was an incredible tradition of artists fighting there, and they made beautiful drawings of everyday life, of war, of helicopters, of people who'd been shot, and many of these drawings turned into portraits that were given to families for people who were killed. Dinh then also made this video that you see next to it, interviewing the artists and sort of animating the drawings into this narrative. And Dinh had grown up in Vietnam, but then emigrated to California during the Vietnam War, grew up there, and was fascinated by the way that America looked at what we call the Vietnam War, and was really questioning the way that the other side was treated. So he's since moved back to Vietnam and spent a lot of time interviewing artists who were fighting. And this is a piece that we saw at Documenta in Germany, and we thought it really had to be shown in the United States for obvious reasons. And this has been a really powerful piece for a lot of people. Just going into the collection galleries again, this is another sculpture by Felita Barlow that you see who did the outside work. And then a light box by Rodney Graham, a Canadian artist who's sort of impersonating an artist from the 1960s, which is called the pipe cleaner artist. This sort of dolce vita, dolce far niente, just sitting in the studio at ease, making these crazy pipe cleaner things. We decided to install this between a Dubuffet and a Giacometti just to put him in his place, quite literally. And Rodney always deals with sort of increasingly these images of, these kind of iconic images of masculinity and creativity, and also the artist's role in society. To another artist who's looking at the artist's role, this is by Mladen Stilinovic, who's a Croatian artist, and this is a work made in the late 70s, and it's called The Artist at Work. And this is like my patron saint of work and art. He looks at laziness as a generative artistic force and the kind of dead time that happens. So here he is sort of just falling asleep over the course of these photographs. And I think it's this really kind of poetic and wry commentary on creative work. We did a sort of retrospective of his works, which have been very little seen in this country. Here's a piece called Bag People, where he took photographs of all these sort of migrant workers with their plastic bags going to work. And that's it. So, thank you. It's sort of an abrupt ending. I forgot how it ended. It hasn't ended, but I'm really happy to answer any questions that people have. Hopefully there are questions. Yes?
You mentioned the Andy Warhol at the Tehran.
Yeah.
Is there quite a...
They are not buying now, but they were. The Shah's wife bought a lot of really important art, and it was a very thriving museum, and now it's this kind of time capsule that's there. And these pieces don't travel that much, as you might imagine. I did in Tokyo, of all places, I saw a Jackson Pollock piece that was borrowed from the Tehran Museum, which is incredible because it'll never come to America, and incredible to sort of think about the journey of this object, from New York or Long Island to Tehran somehow, then to Tokyo and back to Tehran. Yeah?
Definitely a wild and sort of willful disparity of artists and works represented. Obviously very deliberate. So it seems a little bit like herding cats.
Mm-hmm.
There's three of you, and you seek these things, right?
Yeah.
Bring them together. So with the luxury of a little bit of hindsight, a little bit of the long view you have now. Is there does this show then develop? Is there sort of does it come to an identity?
Yeah, so the question about how the show kind of has changed or how we've realized what it is kind of after seeing it. I would say in a pretty decisive way. I think it's hard to tell in the presentation, and in space there is a much more kind of deliberate rhyming that happens. And for us, and for me in particular, I really think that just this question of difference, of how the sort of space in between things and what difference does, the kind of confrontation of different ways of making art, but also, supposedly we live in this very global world. It's easy to travel, there's the internet, but time after time we realized that these artists were making work that was really specific to where they were, that could be understood universally, but that still came from a specific place, and that it matters whether you're in Tehran or rural Poland or San Francisco. And we wanted the show to embody that kind of specificity, and I think it did that, and I think the biggest surprise to me was how accessible it was to a lot of our audience. There's a lot of very difficult imagery, a lot of abrasive things, but at the same time, because there's this concentration, I think, on a kind of human scale, there's a lot to identify with, and people have really kind of latched onto that. When we traveled, we would travel and research separately, but then we would go and see major exhibitions together so that we could create a kind of foundation for our expectation for the show. We'd go to Venice together, or Documenta, but then kind of come back from different places, and we figured if we couldn't convince each other, we couldn't convince an audience. And so there was this great built-in kind of vetting process that happened, and a lot of hard-won conversations and arguments that changed my mind a lot, which to me is kind of the best part of thinking, is having your mind change. So it was a really generative process in that way. Yeah.
So when you three got together and started the planning 3 years ago, was there already a Carnegie exhibit, the previous one? Was it already up at that point?
So
Or was it just down? Or where was that? And now,
what's next?
the new people benefit.
So the last show closed in 2008 or maybe early 2009, and I was hired right after that. So at that time, though, I was doing other shows. So we didn't have a director at the time. There was no chief curator. It was a very transitional time for the museum. And traditionally, the whole curatorial team, from the curator, the assistant curator, curatorial assistant, all leave after each international. I think partially it's just such a traumatic experience that they have to go somewhere else. They're done, wash their hands of it. But it's also a sort of launching pad for a lot of people, and they'll go on to another job. But that's meant that all of that institutional history that we were so interested in has been largely ignored. And there's a kind of ahistorical impulse that happens with that. A team shows up, it's the first time, everyone thinks that their idea is the original first time, but there's this whole 100+ year history, and because we had a little bit more time, because I'd been at the museum for a year and a half, we could really integrate that into the process a little bit more. So the show had been scheduled for October 2013, and we started working in October 2010. The next one is scheduled for October 2018, so I encourage you all to mark your calendars. We had our first meeting about that show on Monday, which itself was a pretty traumatic experience, starting the fundraising. So I think this exhibition changed the paradigm a little bit of what the expectation is. And I think we'll be planning it earlier so that we can make it more site-specific, make it more community-involved. And my position is the first sort of permanent curator of contemporary art. So I can't say I'll be there till I die, but the idea is that I'll stay for a little bit longer and do shows and really build up the contemporary program so that the International doesn't kind of function as this enormous anomaly, but instead is contextualized by other exhibitions.
So how long was that show up?
About 6 months. The previous International, 6 months. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because your intersection comics was a real paradigm shift happen. And as that occurs and the show happens, how did the community react? We didn't hear enough about that.
Yeah, so how did we make the museum look outward? It was a pretty labor-intensive and very important initiative by us, the curators, to do this. And this is not something that past curators had really done. So running an apartment space for 2.5 years where we invited basically thousands of people from Pittsburgh to come for free to see talks and lectures and have dinners was a major thing that made huge waves in Pittsburgh. There were like 6 newspaper articles about it. The Carnegie International curator is usually a very aloof figure who is known to be traveling all the time, and when he or she deigns to come back to Pittsburgh, it's like, don't talk to me. So that role of the curator as kind of auteur was something that we were not interested in, and we created that apartment space so that we would be literally accessible to anyone who wanted us. And that took a lot out of us, but it was crucial to condition the city to think about this as an open experience, as a place where anyone could talk to us about suggestions or reactions, as a place where we made ourselves available. And that was a big kind of shift. Also, the whole playground project, like no one had installed a playground outside the museum. The fact that we were interested in children and education and how children would look at art. The show is not playful necessarily in the idea that it's light or frivolous, but it's playful in the idea that it's about experimentation and risk, and children are often the best kind of consumers of art. They're unprejudiced, they're willing to take risks, and we wanted that idea to kind of come through. And the idea that we were asking parents to bring their children before the show even opened was a major step. Also having these 2 projects, one in Homestead and one in Braddock, which are communities that traditionally do not feel welcome in the museum, was enormously impactful. The idea that the museum put tens of thousands of dollars into creating an art lending collection in this community that's really fallen on hard times meant a lot. And even the idea that we had Pittsburgh artists in the International for the first time in 60 years. So this group from Braddock was, the first time local artists were in the show. Also sent a huge signal to the city. So the show really had this dual responsibility to share Pittsburgh with the world, but also to get all these artists from all these different places into Pittsburgh to meet people and then to go back to wherever they were. And it was really about that kind of reciprocity. Okay, thank you.
I have one burning question. Did you get to keep your frequent flyer miles? I'm just curious. How many miles did you get on that? Oh, okay. Well, good. Well, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Thank you all for being here. Remember to support Art Day of Giving tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing everyone on April 3rd, I believe it is, the final salon of this season. Come back and see us. Oh, and also come by and see Juvenile Injustice for those of you who haven't been, or if you've been, come back with a friend. It's a very, very powerful show. We're getting great community response, and we look forward to seeing you there. Good night.